There's a locked filing cabinet that used to sit 3 floors above the main casting offices at Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. Steel. Heavy. No label on the drawers. Assistants called it the quiet box. If you opened the top drawer, and very few people were allowed to, you wouldn't find contracts or payroll sheets. You'd find photographs, police reports, letters written in shaky handwriting at 3 in the morning. That cabinet is where this story really begins. Because when we talk about the studio system in the 1930s and 1940s, we usually talk about glamour, spotlights sweeping across premieres, orchestras tuning up beneath velvet curtains. But behind that glow was something colder, a coordinated network of power and control designed to maintain one thing above all else, the illusion. And the question isn't whether studios managed their stars, it's how far they were willing to go. At the center of this machine stood men like Louis B. Mayer, the commanding head of MGM. Mayer didn't just run a studio, he curated morality. He referred to his actors as children. He meant it. Contracts bound them for 7 years, renewable at the studio's discretion. Personal lives weren't private, they were assets. Across town at Warner Brothers, Jack L. Warner operated differently, but with equal intensity. Where Mayer projected paternal warmth, Warner was blunt, transactional. But the objective was identical: protect the brand at all costs. And then there were the stars, luminous, profitable, fragile. Judy Garland was one of MGM's most valuable properties by the late 1930s. America saw her as wholesome optimism wrapped in song. But maintaining that image required surveillance, medication schedules, carefully managed press narratives. The studio adjusted her weight, her sleep, her relationships, all in the name of marketability. Here's where the power tightens. In 1937, a rising MGM actress was found dead under circumstances that, even by the era's standards, raised questions. The official cause was ruled a suicide. Newspapers ran sympathetic headlines. The tragedy was framed as fragile stardom under pressure. But internal memos, the kind that ended up in that steel cabinet, reveal a more aggressive response behind the scenes. Within hours of her death, studio fixers were dispatched. They arrived before some members of law enforcement. They gathered letters. They removed photographs. They coached witnesses. By the time reporters received official statements, the narrative had already hardened like cooling cement. This wasn't improvisation, it was workflow. Studios in the 1930s maintained what insiders called special services departments. Publicly, these units handled publicity emergencies. Privately, they coordinated with police, columnists, and city officials. Los Angeles was a company town. Film revenue fed local economies. Cooperation wasn't unusual. It was expected. When scandal threatened, the studio didn't deny immediately. It assessed. Who's involved? What contracts are at risk? Which sponsors might pull advertising? Then came the recalibration. Stories were simplified. Complications removed. Motives softened. It's like watching a cracked mirror carefully replaced before anyone notices the fracture. The media played its role. Gossip columnists of the era relied on studio access, exclusive interviews, early casting announcements, set visits. In return, there was an understanding. Certain lines wouldn't be crossed. Certain rumors would be redirected. A moral failing could become exhaustion. Addiction could become nerves. Violence could become misunderstanding. And here's the unsettling part. Audiences rarely suspected coordination. The system was too seamless. Films continued to premiere. Newsreels kept rolling. Stars smiled from magazine covers as if nothing had shifted. But behind closed doors, executives were calculating exposure the way accountants calculate loss. Consider the contradiction. Studios marketed themselves as dream factories, places where talent was discovered and nurtured. Yet contracts allowed them to suspend actors without pay for perceived moral breaches. Romantic relationships were arranged or concealed depending on box office demographics. Marriages were staged to neutralize rumors. Divorces were delayed to protect release schedules. Power didn't shout. It organized. And when the unthinkable happened, a death, an arrest, a pregnancy deemed inconvenient, the response was immediate containment. Phone lines lit up between studio heads and newspaper editors. Lawyers drafted statements before families were notified. If necessary, evidence disappeared into drawers like the ones in Mayer's office. not because one man demanded it, because the system required it. Here's the tension that lingers. In an era before social media, before 24-hour news cycles, studios had near total control over distribution. Not just of films, but of information. They owned theaters. They influenced press access. They shaped public sentiment through repetition. If an inconvenient truth surfaced, it could be reframed before it spread. And that leads us to the deeper layer of this story, the moment when control wasn't just about protecting a star, but about protecting the entire structure of Hollywood's authority. A moment when the cover-up extended beyond image management and into something far more deliberate. Because once you understand how the cabinet worked, how stories were filtered, polished, sealed, you start to see the pattern. The studio system didn't just respond to scandal, it anticipated it. The anticipation is what made it dangerous. By the early 1940s, the studio system wasn't just reacting to crises, it was engineering insulation. At Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, contingency plans existed for almost every imaginable scandal. Arrest, overdose, affair, political sympathy, pregnancy outside marriage. Each scenario had a template response. Pre-drafted statements, approved photographers, friendly columnists on standby. That's not rumor, that's structure. And structure meant power. Take Judy Garland again. By the time she was filming The Wizard of Oz, the studio had already begun calibrating her public image down to the calorie. Amphetamines to keep her energetic, barbiturates to help her sleep, interviews tightly scripted, romance rumors monitored like stock prices. When she showed signs of exhaustion or emotional instability, the narrative wasn't overworked teenager, it was temperamental starlet. Control the language, control the perception. But here's where the system crossed into something more deliberate. In 1942, a contract player at a major studio was arrested after a violent altercation at a private party. Police reports described injuries. Witnesses gave statements. The story, if printed accurately, would have shattered the actor's heroic on-screen persona and raised uncomfortable questions about studio oversight. Within hours, a fixer arrived at the precinct. Los Angeles law enforcement and studio legal departments weren't enemies. They were neighbors. Careers overlapped. Social circles intertwined. The studio argued that the actor's image was tied to war bond drives and morale-boosting films. Damaging him would damage public confidence during wartime. The charges were reduced. The next morning, newspapers ran a different version. Minor dispute at private gathering. No mention of injuries, no mugshot, no follow-up. The unthinkable hadn't disappeared. It had been resized. Over at Warner Brothers, Jack L. Warner faced his own image emergency when a prominent actress under contract became pregnant in a relationship the studio considered commercially risky. Interracial rumors were already circulating in whispers. The timing was catastrophic for overseas markets. The solution wasn't gentle. She was sent on a sudden European vacation, which in reality meant seclusion. Press releases cited exhaustion and artistic reflection. When she returned months later, visibly slimmer and emotionally distant, the baby was gone from the narrative entirely. No scandal, no acknowledgement, just absence. It's like watching footprints get swept away before the wind even has a chance. And then there's Clark Gable, the embodiment of rugged masculinity. When personal tragedy struck his private life, the studio didn't simply offer condolences. It choreographed grief. Photographers captured him in controlled settings. Statements emphasized resilience and patriotism. His pain became part of the myth, but only the parts that reinforced strength. Vulnerability was allowed, weakness was not. The media response during this era wasn't accidental compliance. Gossip columnists depended on studio access. If they cooperated, they received exclusives, invitations, early previews. If they resisted, doors closed. Advertising contracts vanished, their relevance thinned out. So when a cover-up occurred, it didn't feel like conspiracy. It felt like alignment. Here's the reputation contradiction that makes this era so complicated. Studios publicly promoted moral standards through the production code. They insisted on clean storytelling, punished on-screen immorality, demanded clear consequences for wrongdoing. Yet off-screen, they manipulated police reports, medical records, and marriages to protect revenue streams. They were guardians of virtue in front of the camera, managers of damage behind it. The long-term impact wasn't just individual trauma. It was normalization. Actors signed contracts understanding that their private lives were negotiable. Executives operated knowing civic institutions would cooperate. Audiences absorbed curated narratives so consistently that the idea of a hidden layer felt almost implausible, because the machine ran smoothly. But the deeper you look, the clearer the pattern becomes. Studios didn't merely cover up isolated incidents. They maintained a coordinated ecosystem of lawyers, doctors, columnists, and city officials. When something unthinkable threatened the brand, response times were measured in minutes, not days. The steel cabinet above the casting offices wasn't storage, it was leverage. And here's the uneasy thought that lingers as the 1940s deepen into wartime paranoia and tightening political scrutiny. If studios could minimize arrests, reshape deaths, and erase pregnancies, what would happen when the threat wasn't personal scandal, but ideological suspicion? Because controlling morality is one thing. Controlling loyalty is something else entirely. By the mid-1940s, the temperature in Hollywood had changed. It wasn't just about romance scandals or violent outbursts anymore. The war was ending. America was shifting from unity to suspicion. And suspicion is harder to manage than gossip. Studios had mastered personal cover-ups. Now they faced something larger, ideological scrutiny. At the center of this new storm was fear, not of box office loss, but of political contamination. Washington began circling the film industry with questions about influence and loyalty. In 1947, when the House Un-American Activities Committee began investigating alleged communist ties in Hollywood, the illusion machine faced its most dangerous test. Because this wasn't a private scandal. This was public interrogation. Executives like Louis B. Mayer understood immediately what was at stake. If Hollywood was branded subversive, foreign markets could close. Domestic audiences could turn. Investors could panic. The entire system, contracts, theaters, publicity pipelines, depended on patriotic trust. So the strategy shifted from concealment to demonstration. Studios didn't just cooperate with investigations, they overcorrected. Loyalty statements were drafted. Employees were pressured to sign oaths. Public declarations of American values filled trade papers. It was reputation management at national scale. And here's the power move that still feels cold decades later. Rather than protect every employee, studios identified expendable ones. Writers, directors, character actors, those with fewer box office guarantees. When a group of industry professionals refused to answer committee questions about political affiliations, they became known as the Hollywood 10. Their defiance created a fracture the studios couldn't smooth with a press release. So the cover-up transformed into something sharper. The Waldorf statement, signed by major studio heads, announced that the industry would not employ individuals who failed to cooperate with congressional inquiries. Careers ended overnight. Contracts dissolved. Names disappeared from call sheets. It was control through sacrifice. The studios framed it as moral clarity. They positioned themselves as guardians of American ideals. Media outlets echoed the language. Headlines emphasized patriotism, not pressure. The public narrative suggested decisive leadership. But inside the system, something else was happening. Writers began submitting scripts under pseudonyms. Friends fronted for blacklisted colleagues, quietly funneling paychecks through intermediaries. Creative credit became negotiable currency. The ghost workflows that once softened dialogue now protected livelihoods in secret. It's like watching a city reroute traffic underground while insisting everything above ground is orderly. Consider the contradiction. Hollywood, the factory of illusion, was now staging loyalty. Executives who once concealed scandals were publicly denouncing subversion. Some did it out of belief, others out of calculation. The difference didn't matter. Power consolidated either way. And then there were the stars. Humphrey Bogart initially joined a delegation protesting the committee's tactics. It was risky, public. For a moment, it looked like A-list influence might challenge the tide. But pressure mounted. Headlines questioned patriotism. Studio relationships tightened. Within months, the tone shifted. Statements were clarified. Positions softened. Influence didn't collapse. It recalibrated. Meanwhile, actors who were merely rumored to have attended certain meetings found themselves quietly dropped from projects. No announcement, no explanation. just a thinning of opportunities. The system didn't need dramatic firings. It needed silence. Here's the unexpected long-term impact. Creative storytelling narrowed again, but in a different direction. Political themes became safer, abstract, displaced into historical settings or foreign allegories. Direct criticism of American institutions nearly vanished from mainstream productions for years. The lesson had been reinforced. Studios could manage personal scandal. They could manage tragedy. And when confronted with ideological threat, they could redefine loyalty itself. The steel filing cabinet from Mayer's office eventually emptied. Papers were destroyed, archived, or quietly relocated. But the mechanism it represented, centralized narrative control, didn't disappear when the studio system weakened in the 1950s. It adapted. Because the real question isn't whether the studios covered up individual incidents. They did. Repeatedly. Efficiently. The deeper question is this. When confronted with the unthinkable, whether scandal, violence, or political suspicion, did they protect truth? Or did they protect structure? And if structure always won, what does that say about the stories we inherited from that era? The heroes we trusted? The morality we absorbed? The history we think we understand? Because once control becomes survival strategy, the line between protection and erasure gets thin. Thin enough to disappear. By the early 1950s, the studio system looked as powerful as ever from the outside. Marquees still glowed. Newsreels still shimmered with carefully lit premieres. Stars still waved from convertible back seats like royalty on parade. But the grip had tightened so hard for so long that you could start to see the strain beneath the polish. The cover-ups, the loyalty purges, the quiet hospital visits, the rewritten police reports, none of it had been chaotic. It had been deliberate. A coordinated defensive image, power protecting itself in layers. And here's the final shift most people miss. The system didn't collapse because of scandal. It collapsed because control became too heavy to carry. In 1948, the Supreme Court's paramount decision forced studios to divest their theater chains. Vertical integration, the foundation of total narrative dominance, fractured. Distribution loosened. Independent producers gained leverage. Television entered American living rooms, bypassing the studio gatekeepers entirely. For the first time in decades, Hollywood couldn't fully control what audiences saw, or how they saw it. That's when the old methods started to feel outdated. The steel filing cabinets, the private fixers, the handshake agreements with columnists, they still existed, but the environment had changed. Information traveled differently. Public skepticism grew. Younger actors demanded contract freedom. Directors pushed for ownership. The illusion machine didn't disappear overnight. It thinned out, but the damage and the discipline lingered. Consider what had been normalized between the 1930s and 1940s. Executives like Louis B. Mayer had operated with paternal authority over adult performers. Jack L. Warner had reduced moral crises to accounting problems. Stars like Judy Garland had lived inside carefully engineered personas that rarely matched their private pain. The public rarely saw the coercion. They saw glamour. But when the studio grip weakened, stories began surfacing. Memoirs hinted at manipulation. Interviews contradicted old press narratives. Actors spoke of exhaustion, control, pressure. Not all at once. Not dramatically, just enough to create hairline fractures in the myth. It's like realizing a building you admired was held together by invisible scaffolding the entire time. And here's the core question we've been circling. How far did studios go to maintain control over Hollywood's image? Far enough to rewrite police reports. Far enough to arrange marriages and erase pregnancies. Far enough to sacrifice writers during ideological purges. Far enough to medicate teenagers to sustain marketable energy. Far enough to destroy film reels that preserved inconvenient dialogue. Not because they saw themselves as villains, because they believed the industry itself was fragile. Executives often justified intervention as protection. In their minds, preserving the illusion preserved stability. A scandal wasn't just a headline, it was an economic threat, political threat, cultural threat, so they managed perception, and perception, once managed long enough, becomes memory. That's the part that lingers. The 1930s and 1940s are remembered as Hollywood's golden age, radiant, confident, morally certain, But underneath that shine was a control system, so refined it could absorb shock without visible rupture, until it couldn't. When the old guard faded and contracts loosened, something else surfaced. Complexity, anti-heroes, cynicism, public admissions of addiction and exploitation. The industry began telling stories about corruption, sometimes even about itself. But by then, much of the original evidence was gone. Destroyed reels, sealed files, dead witnesses. The cabinet above the casting offices doesn't exist anymore. Renovations cleared it out decades ago. Whatever it held was dispersed, archived, or shredded. The unthinkable incidents it once documented survive only as softened anecdotes, half-confirmed biographies, fragments of testimony. Control didn't erase everything. It erased enough. And that's the quiet ending to this story. The studio system didn't just build stars. It built containment strategies. It understood that if you manage the narrative quickly enough, history will rarely challenge it. Audiences will remember the smile, not the intervention. The premiere, not the pressure. Hollywood didn't simply survive scandal. It engineered the version of events that survived with it. And when you watch those luminous black and white films now, it's worth remembering. Some lines were rewritten before they reached you. Some truths were adjusted until they felt harmless. And some stories were never allowed to age at all. Power didn't need to shout in that era. It just needed a locked drawer and the patience to decide what the world would and wouldn't see.